In this second part of the lecture, we talk about ocean carbon pumps. Okay, what are ocean carbon pumps? Okay. So ocean carbon pumps are mechanisms that remove CO2 from the atmosphere and transport it from surface layers to the deep ocean. Okay, so it is defined as a sink mechanism of carbon. Okay, there are three different mechanisms, three different pumps that can be attributed to different processes. The first one is called the solubility pump. Okay, it's the vertical CO2 flux exclusively by currents. You have a removal of CO2 from surface layers of the ocean by currents, such as the formation of deep and bottom water and the deep circulation in the ocean. Okay. The second mechanism is the so-called soft tissue pump. It's about the vertical CO2 flux driven by phytoplankton production in the surface ocean and gravitational settling of dead organic matter. Okay. We call it detritus. The third pump is a calcium carbonate counterpump. It's actually linked to an opposite CO2 flux induced by the formation or erosion of calcareous skeleton material. Okay, let's talk first about the air sea gas transfer. Okay. So now the issue what we're having is we have a certain CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. Okay, on one side, and we call that here delta P CO2. It can be expressed by a certain partial gas pressure. Okay, CO2 in that mixture of gases can be attributed a partial gas pressure, a part of the entire pressure in the atmosphere. On the other side, we have a certain CO2 concentration in the ocean. Okay, a certain CO2 concentration, and then the question is, well, is that the ocean now oversaturated or is it undersaturated? And this can be understood if you work out the equilibrium gas concentration. What is the equilibrium gas concentration of CO2, which is a function of the temperature? Temperature controls this equilibrium gas concentration. Okay? So if you now have a surface mixed layer of the ocean which is undersaturated, where the concentration is below the equilibrium concentration, you get an uptake of CO2. If it's oversaturated, if it exceeds the equilibrium gas concentration, you get an outgassing, which is a flux of CO2 from the ocean into the atmosphere. And it's the temperature of the surface mixed layer that controls this equilibrium gas concentration. Okay. So now in terms of the flux, what also controls the magnitude of the flux is the wind speed. It's very similar to sensible heat fluxes or latent heat fluxes. The wind speed, the wind, and in addition to that also wave breaking. If you have wave breaking features, they're actually the agents of this exchange. And this is just shown here in a little formula. It's something we call a piston velocity. It's proportional to the wind speed. Okay, that's the flux. So now you might be interested to know, how does it look like the air sea gas transfer if you look at the distribution of the CO2 transfer. And you might actually be a little bit confused, but we do that. I'll just show you a map, okay, of Well, how does it look like? Where do you have regions where you have an uptake of CO2, and where do you have an outgassing of CO2 from the oceans? And this is shown here in this map, and you can see the red and yellow parts are regions where you have an outgassing. Okay, and what's shown here is not the flux; it's only the difference, whether you have a positive or a negative number means you have outgassing or you have an uptake. It doesn't show you essentially the magnitude. Anyway, okay, you have regions where you have outgassing. You can see the equatorial regions are regions where you have outgassing, and then you have, if you go higher up into the northern hemisphere or southern hemisphere, you have regions where you have an uptake. Okay, and in order to understand this structure, well, you learned about subtropical gyres, and it's all taking place in subtropical gyres. And it's above my head shows you the structure. Okay, it's how it works in terms of uptake and outgassing. Okay, and it's based on subtropical gyres, which move water masses around, which move warm water on the western side into colder climates, and the cooling creates a CO2 uptake. Then they come around on the other side, move colder water into warmer regions, and the temperature changes, and it produces a CO2 release and outgassing. Okay, and this in both hemispheres, and this is how you get these structures in all regions of the oceans. Okay, so it is a structure. You have a continuous outgassing uptake cycle in horizontal current systems. I mean, this does not help you much to understand the net effect of the ocean. Does the ocean operate as a sink or as a source of carbon if you average now over the entire region? However, you learn that once you look at the vertical structure, and we do that at the end of this part. Okay, the vertical structure of dissolved CO2 in the oceans. So let's see what comes on the next slide. Okay, it's an explanation of the soft tissue carbon pump. How does it work in the ocean? And there are a number of important features that you need to understand. The first important feature is that light doesn't penetrate deep into the oceans, only by something like 50 meters. So the photosynthesis that you can have in the ocean is limited to 50-meter depth. And this is what we call the euphotic zone. Okay? Euphotic zone, 50 meters, and photosynthesis is the mechanism by which inorganic carbon is converted to organic carbon, okay, in the form of plankton, okay, and it also produces oxygen, that mechanism. Okay, so that's the part. Here you have phytoplankton production. However, as organisms die, okay, and the particles, this detritus, the particles are slightly heavier than water, so they sink. Okay, you get sinking of detritus particles. Okay, and then bacteria come into play. Bacteria don't require light, and bacteria decompose this dead organic matter, it's called remineralization, and bring back the particles into solution, into dissolved substances. So at depth, you have a high level of dissolved nutrients and also CO2. Once you have a solution again, particles can no longer sink. And this happens in the oceans in a depth range around 1 kilometer. Okay, in the upper kilometers of the ocean. Okay. There's another little problem here, because you usually don't have much nutrients in the surface layers of the ocean, because it just stuff sinks away, sinks into deeper layers. So in order to get this phytoplankton production, you need to have something we call primary nutrients, which is nitrogen and phosphorus. You need that. You also need amounts of iron, okay, which is a critical, which we call a micronutrient. And it's the process of upwelling that creates this flux of high levels of dissolved nutrients into the euphotic zone. And upwelling is a physical process. And there are different mechanisms creating upwelling, but the most significant one is winds blowing along the coast trigger a process that we call coastal upwelling. So alongside near coasts, if you have the winds blow into the right direction and for a sufficiently long time, you trigger phytoplankton blooms, which is the start of the marine food web. Okay, this is how marine food webs form. Okay, it's a little bit a long story, but this story contains the key features that helps you to understand the CO2 distributions in the ocean. Okay. Why do we want to know CO2 distributions in the ocean? We want to know that because by measuring CO2 levels, we can actually tell changes. So how has the CO2 distribution changed in the ocean over the last 20, 30 years? And from that, we can tell whether the ocean is a carbon sink or a source for the atmosphere. And that's an important difference. All right, so let's go to the next slide. Let's have a look at the dissolved CO2 distributions in the oceans. Okay. All right, so these are vertical slices. So imagine you have the world is a big cake, and you can cut through different sections, and the top cut shows you the Atlantic Ocean slice of the cake. And this is a CO2 cake. It has CO2 is shown here in terms of micromoles per kilogram. Okay, let's focus on this first. And then we look at the other slices. Okay, you can see colors, and there's a color scale. Okay, I show again, my mouse is activated now. Here we are. The top is the Atlantic Ocean slice. Okay, so what do the colors show? Here's a scale. Okay, something that says pre-industrial. This is something, taking away the human-induced CO2 addition. Okay. And you can see that there's something like from blue is low, the number 1,800, and red is above 2,300. So red is high CO2 concentrations, blue is low concentrations. Let's have a look at the structure. You can see actually the structure of what we call the permanent thermocline. This is the warm water. Okay, and warm water has a lower solubility compared to cold water. It can hold less CO2 compared with cold water. Okay. That's why we have lower concentrations near the surface. At depth, we have higher concentrations, okay, because we have the flow of colder water from the North Atlantic. This is the so-called deep water, okay? And from Antarctic shelves, we have Antarctic bottom water. These are cold waters, and they can hold more CO2 and can transport it into the deeper parts of the ocean. This is what we call the solubility pump mechanism. Okay, so now let's move through the oceans. We are in the Atlantic Ocean. This is our first slice. The second slice is the Indian Ocean, and we are always looking from south to north. South is on the west, and north is on the right. And the Indian Ocean only goes to 20 degrees north. That's where the continent, the land masses start. Okay, and let's have a look. Similar, low at the surface, high values at depth, and the Pacific Ocean, again similar, low at the surface, higher depth. However, if you now compare the Atlantic with the Indian and with the Pacific Ocean, you can see it turns progressively more orange and more red. So dissolved CO2 at depth increases as you move from the Atlantic to the Indian to the Pacific Ocean. Why is that? Now you have to understand the soft tissue pump, because as you move with the deep circulation of the ocean from the North Atlantic to the North Pacific, and you're moving along, there is the addition of detritus, sinking dead organic matter, which becomes dissolved, remineralized, and releases CO2. Okay, so as you move along, the CO2 concentration increases. And this is how you explain or understand the distribution in the oceans. Okay. All right. So you learn quite a bit here about dissolved CO2 distributions in the ocean, and in a future lecture we look at how this has changed. And that's the important bit. Where do we get rapid changes? If you now think about you increase atmospheric CO2 concentrations significantly within a time scale of 20 to 30 years, where do you get the big changes first? You know, what happens in the oceans? Okay. And the other more important question, well, is the ocean a sink or a source of CO2? Because if it's a sink, means that dangerous greenhouse gas, CO2, is actually removed, which actually makes the climate, the global warming effect, weaker than it would be otherwise. Alrighty, so just the last slide of this lecture answers the question, where does this plankton productivity occur? Does it occur evenly across the oceans or in particular regions? And this is a map of something we call the net primary production, and it's averaged here over 8 years. It's based on satellite data and estimates of how much carbon is converted from so-called inorganic carbon, dissolved carbon that comes from the atmosphere, okay, or is somehow recycled, and organic carbon. Okay, and what's the unit here? It's annual grams of carbon per square meter. But anyway, you see there are regions where you see red, and these are regions where you have a very high levels of plankton productivity. Okay, and that's fairly regional regions. Okay, some are in the open ocean, okay, but most of them are in coastal regions. And this is now linked to the process that I mentioned before. One reason, coastal upwelling systems. It's a wind-driven mechanism, lifting nutrient-rich water into the euphotic zone. And the other reason is the nutrient supply by rivers. Okay, the nutrient supply by rivers. You even have in this map regions where there is almost no primary production. Yeah, you can see these blue, light blue areas. And these are also known as marine deserts, regions where you have little productivity, and mainly because you have no nutrients. Okay? Not macronutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, but also no micronutrients like iron. Okay? So, all right, so that's the end of this lecture, and I have some study questions for you. What's the seasonal thermocline? Why does the deep ocean contain more dissolved CO2 than surface waters? Which properties control the vertical density structure of the oceans? What are ocean carbon pumps? Why is the primary production spatially so variable in the oceans? And which factors limit photosynthesis in the oceans? So, all right, thanks for watching.